Right? You're writing a story about what?
Something that had two legs.
Oh.
Where were those two legs?
They were in the forest by the gas station.
Good evening, and welcome to another edition of the Virtual School with Mr. Russ. This evening we will be discussing the wonderful American poet Walt Whitman. But before we get there, first we should look at some photographs or paintings of some other austere American literary poets. Must be wrong. That last picture cannot possibly be right. No. It is. What is he doing there, that farmer? Get him out of here. Okay, that's enough of that. Whitman is so radically different from everyone that comes before him that showing that visually, I think, works really well for us. Yeah, he put on a jacket and tie later on in his life, and occasionally for his more regular appearances, but all those guys had the full cravats on, they had the nice coats on, they were all dressed up. Those are their formal pictures. What sets Whitman apart is that photograph of him is the one that appeared in all of his books. That's the way he wanted to portray himself to the world. A normal working class person, totally different from the level way up here where everybody else was. And even in his later life, this one, he's still in his shirt sleeves. I don't think this is going to work either. Whitman is a guy hypercritical of his image at all times, and he wanted this to come out in all of his writing. He took himself pretty seriously. His most famous volume of poetry is really his largest volume of poetry. This is what's called the deathbed edition of his book, Leaves of Grass. It's called Leaves of Grass because that's what we are to him. We're just leaves of grass. Grass that, as he says in one of the verses of Song of Myself, what is the grass? A child pulled for me grass and said, what is the grass? How could I answer him? I don't know. For me, it is the fresh cut hair of new graves. Because that's what we all are. We're just going to become grass again in this great cycle and circle. And so when he sees us, he sees grass itself. And his most famous poem, arguably his most famous poem from Leaves of Grass, is Song of Myself, the 52-verse poem that we are working our way through right now. Let's take a look at some of it. This is verse 1 of Song of Myself, and I know it's up here way too short a time for you to be able to read it, but we're really going to concern ourselves with these first 3 lines. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume, you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you. How arrogant is this guy? He writes a 52-verse poem, 100+ pages long depending on your edition, called Song of Myself, and he starts it by saying, I celebrate myself and sing myself. Basically, he says, I'm the greatest person who's ever lived. I celebrate myself and sing myself. This entire poem, it's about me. It's called Song of Myself. And look at him. Look at this dude. He's awesome. Like, there's no debating that. Then he says, what I assume, you shall assume. So if he thinks he's awesome, he's going to spend the rest of this poem proving to us just how awesome he is. And then here's where things get a little weird. The 3rd line says, for every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you. So there's a couple things that we got to talk about for a second. And one of them is a very loose, Englishy interpretation of a principle in chemistry called Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle has to do with atoms themselves. And it states that you're never quite sure where electrons are in atoms or anything until you observe it. And once you look at something, you lock it into place. But when you're not observing that thing, those electrons are free to do basically whatever they want and go all over the place. So that means that until I look at something or I observe it, and observing it could mean you see it, you hear it, you smell it, you're observing it. Until I'm doing that thing, anything I'm not observing is a mishmash of absolute nonsense. So the electrons that are in me are free to move to anywhere. So right now they're moving between my butt and the chair I'm sitting in. They're moving between my shirt and the atoms in me. They're moving between my hand and the air. And when they go into the air, they go from atom to atom to atom until they eventually get to you, wherever you are right now. So quite a long time before Heisenberg made his theory, Whitman is talking about the interconnectivity of all of us. For every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you. Because we're all one. Song of myself is really the song of you. Try and move through this pretty quickly because there's a lot of material to cover. So in verse 2, which is one of the ones I'd ask you to take a look at. In verse 2, Whitman writes, "Have you reckoned 1,000 acres much? Have you reckoned the earth much? Have you practiced so long to learn to read?" Have you? I mean, you're here. You wouldn't get here now without learning how to read. I doubt you would be in this class without the ability to read. Not saying that you like reading, but that you can do it. You read the back of your cereal box in the morning? You had to practice to get there. What other things have you practiced in order to get good at? Adventure Time, one of the greatest shows ever made, has this line in it that says, "Sucking at something is the first step in becoming great at something." You have to practice. Right after that, he says, "Have you felt so proud to get at the meaning of poems?" We've read a lot of poems this year. When you're able to figure out those pieces, that's hard. Poetry, like life, is not easy. If it were easy, anybody would do it and everybody would love it. But they don't. The same with life. You have to practice. And you have to work at it. "And if you stop this day and night with me, you shall possess the origin of all poems." Whitman's not just talking about poetry. He's going to help you with everything. Move into verse 3 for a second. He starts verse 3 by saying, "I have heard what the talkers were talking, the talk of the beginning and the end, but I do not talk of the beginning or the end." And here's where he talks about what matters most. "There was never any more inception than there is now, nor any more youth or age than there is now, and will never be any more perfection than there is now, nor any more heaven or hell than there is now." This is going to sound like some kind of chain email that your weird aunt puts up on Facebook, but I heard this bit of wisdom in a film, and I think that it simplifies it really, really well for us. So I'm just going to give you the line. You can figure out where it's from. And Whitman sums it up right here. Whitman's basically saying, by saying that there's never more any inception than there is now, there's never any more perfection than there is right now. What he's saying is that yesterday is history, and that tomorrow is a mystery, and today is a gift. That's why it's called the present. Thank you, Master Oogway. There's only this moment. There's no guarantee of the next one. The one that has already happened is already gone, and you're never going to have it back. It's out of here. So if you place your best days in a future that has yet to happen with no promise of its existence, or if you put your best days in a past that you can never return to, where are you living? You're in neither of those moments. The only minute you have is the one that you are in immediately. And it is so hard for us, especially as teenagers, in order to think and live in that particular moment. And Whitman tries to draw our attention to it. Especially now in the situation that we're in. It is so hard to live in the moment with an uncertain future and a glorious past that we cannot return to. What are we doing if not living for right now? It's the only moment we have. And Whitman asks us to really grab onto it. Okay, verse 7 takes a weird turn right at the start. Verse 7 starts, Has anyone supposed it lucky to be born? Well, have you? There's a pretty common statistic number floating around the internet that you have like a 1 in 400 million plus chance of being born. Or let me rephrase that, being conceived. And you guys have probably been through health class to figure out what I'm talking about, but that's a pretty staggering chance. And yet here you are. So how do you get here? I mean, like, we understand the mechanics of it, like the actual mechanics of having a kid, but have you ever considered what it takes for you to listen to me right now? And we've been through this before, but what's step one in you hearing this? Step one to you hearing my voice right now is to create the universe. Everything else has happened in a specific order that leads to you hearing my voice coming from through your headphones or computer speakers right now to tell you that Walt Whitman is the man. And verse 7 continues with a little bit more, where he doesn't care who you are or where you've come from, because Whitman loves all people. Whitman says a little later on in verse 7, every kind for itself and its own, for me, mine, male and female. For me, those that have been boys and that love women. For me, the man that is proud and feels how it stings to be slighted. For me, the sweetheart and the old maid. For me, mothers and the mothers of mothers. For me, lips that have smiled, eyes that have shed tears. For me, children and the begetters of children. I love all of you guys, no matter what. That's Walt Whitman's mantra. And I think it's important that we take a moment to talk about one of the things about Walt Whitman that sometimes make him difficult for some people to teach. Walt Whitman was totally gay. He was out, not out per se. He had spread a rumor about himself that he had an illegitimate child running around in Europe, which was not true. But Walt Whitman definitely spent time with other men. Oscar Wilde, one of the most famous Irish writers of all time, came over to the United States, and when he went home, he wrote in his diary, I believe it was, that the kiss of Walt Whitman is still on my lips. Bram Stoker, the guy who wrote Dracula, wrote Walt Whitman pages and pages of love letters expounding how much he loved him and wished he could spend time with him. Whitman was a lover of all people, and it wasn't just men, it wasn't just women, and it wasn't always of a sexual nature. Whitman was a lover of humanity, and if you were a human, he understood you and he loved you no matter what. Didn't matter what kind of baggage you came with, didn't matter where you had been, or didn't matter what you had done. He loved you. There were no conditions. That bearded, old Santa Claus looking dude was always there for you. So if Whitman's thesis in the first 3 lines is that he's the coolest guy in the entire world, that he's going to prove it to you, and that we're all the same person, he starts to make these connections between being the same person around verse 10. It's going to continue for a lot of the poem, but he says in verse 10, in the first stanza, he becomes a guy hunting with his dog. In the second stanza, he's a sailor. In the third stanza, he's digging up clams. In the fourth stanza, he's a trapper at a wedding. He is a guest at a wedding of a trapper and an Indian, a Native American. Then by the last stanza, he becomes the host of a runaway slave. So this is a very interesting time in American history, as you're probably learning about right now in your history classes, when the fugitive slave law is really kicking off. So the fugitive slave law says that anybody who harbors a slave is in just as much trouble as the slave is. That's not a good look for anybody. Fugitive slave law is one of the most despicable laws that the United States has ever passed. And Whitman, being adamantly about the sovereignty of the individual, feels like slavery is a big no. It's not going to work for him. So he helps this guy. In this stanza, he brought water and filled a tub for his sweated body and bruised feet. He gave him a room that entered from... I gave him a room that entered from my own, and gave him coarse, clean clothes. And I remember well his revolving eyes and his awkwardness. This slave is very uncomfortable being in this house because he's being hunted. And Whitman dresses his wounds. He lets him sleep in a room next to his own. It's like letting a guy sleep in your closet, essentially, is what it is. And what's most important is the last line. I had him sit next to me at table. Where's a slave supposed to eat dinner in a white man's house? Definitely not at the table. So by Whitman having the slave sit on an equal playing field with him, he raises the slave from slave to human, as Whitman feels he deserves. He sees a guy in trouble, and he gives him a place to stay for the night. This idea is going to be continued in verse 33. So let's start to head over that way. 33 is a biggie. It's the largest section of the poem. So the largest section of Song of Myself. It goes on for pages and pages of imagery. And that's exactly what it is. It's Whitman painting a picture, a large swath of America, with words. And he's doing it in these single line images. And he uses a lot of repetition. He uses a lot of very easy and descriptive words. He's not using metaphor. He's not using simile here. He's very upfront and in your face. It is this idea that we had spoken about where Whitman tries to take some of the ideas of Emerson. Emerson had called for there to be a national poet because there wasn't one. And Emerson knew one of his shortcomings was that he is very grandiose and has a very difficult time conveying his ideas to the common people. That's where this American poet is supposed to come in and make everything accessible. And that's what Whitman does. And he understands that if he uses the language of the academy, it's not going to filter down to the normal person. That's also the same reason why he dresses differently from them. He has himself presented in work clothes, in shirt sleeves, without a coat on, without a tie on, without his buttons all the way up, in a jaunty hat, standing up with his hand to his side as though he just walked in off the fields. Because Whitman is one of us. Although he exists ethereally in this great world, he's also connected to us. And because he's so great and we're so great, it elevates our own level. So let's take a look at 33. The first lines of 33 are, space and time, now I see it is true, what I guessed at, what I guessed when I loafed on the grass, what I guessed while I lay alone in my bed, and again as I walked the beach under the paling stars of the morning. And this is when he starts to paint his picture. So that which is true for him is all of these images. It's as though he sees everything in this reminiscent moment where he's laying on grass. Because if you remember back from verse 1, he leans and loafs at his ease, reclining, observing a spear of summer grass. This entire thing is him laying out in a field, looking at grass. And these are all the ideas that come to him as he's doing it. And his mind is free to wander anywhere because he's not tied to that single spot. In the same way that right now you're starting to drift off from listening to me talk, that's what's happening to Whitman as he's taking a look at this single blade of grass. And remember, that's us. So he expounds on all of these different images until we get into verse 33 a bit, where he says, I understand the large hearts of heroes. And here we have a recurring bit similar to what we find in verse 10, where Whitman becomes different people, or he has different experiences. 33 is slightly different than verse 10. And then in verse 10, Whitman he's seeing these things happen. He helps the slave. He goes and watches the wedding. In 33, big difference. He talks first about, and this is one of my favorite lines of the poem, he talks first about seeing this is based on a real news article that he had read about a ship that was sinking, and how a steamship saw this other sinking steamship in a storm and followed with it and tacked with it days and nights. And this is one of my favorite lines, and chalked in large letters on a board, be of good cheer, we will not desert you. Is the message that the good ship held up to the sinking ship and all the people on it. We're not going to let you go. How encouraging is that in your own life? When you feel like you're on a sinking ship, imagine having someone so near you that is willing to stay with you through the worst of it and holding up a sign that says, be of good cheer, we will not desert you. That's what Walt Whitman does. He is the captain of that ship. And he talks about, little later on in the same stanza, he talks about how he saw all the people being picked up from this sinking ship and how they were all saved. And he says, all this I swallow. It tastes good. I like it well. It becomes mine. I am the man. I suffered. I was there. Whitman's now not just observing things happening. He becomes them. He then talks quickly about a few different things happening. He says that he is a mother who's burnt as a witch as her child gazes on. He talks about how he is the hounded slave that flags in the race. He leans by the fence, blowing, covered with sweat. All these I feel or am. Now, I don't know if you noticed from the picture of Whitman, he's never been a mom, and he has never been a slave in America. But these things he feels and is. I want to read this whole stanza. I am the hounded slave. I wince at the bite of the dogs. Hell and despair are upon me. Crack and again crack the marksman. I clutch the rails of the fence. My gore dribs, thinned with the ooze of my skin. I fall on the weeds and stones. The riders spur their unwilling horses, haul close, taunt my dizzy ears, and beat me violently over the head with whipstocks. Agonies are one of my changes of garments. I do not ask the wounded person how he feels. I myself become the wounded person. My hurts turn livid upon me as I lean on a cane and observe. Whitman becomes the wounded person. This is a man who has an exceptional amount of empathy, unlike anything that we've read before. If an author's job is to put the reader in someone else's position, to think or be inside someone else's head, Whitman is a master of that. Because he does it all the time. You've heard the line, walk a mile in someone's shoes before you judge them. Whitman lives a lifetime in everyone else's shoes. Because remember, we're all connected. Every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. He talks about being a fireman who dies in a crushed building and how his comrades watch him die. He talks about being an old artillerist who dies, who is part of a bombardment. And he remembers the heroism of the people there. These are very different places to be. A sinking ship, a battlefield, a wounded slave, a mother burnt at the stake. He's all over the place, just like he was with the rest of the images earlier. Because there is no one experience that is the correct experience. For Whitman, all experiences are valued because all experiences are connected. That's the beauty of 33. That's the beauty of Walt Whitman. I feel like I keep ending these with, that's the beauty of, and these big lofty statements, but guys, I told you, he's really good. 51 of 52. We're at the end. In the other verses that I asked you to take a look at in 44, Whitman starts it by saying, it's time to explain myself. Let us stand up. And so he gets up. If we've been imagining him lying in this field this entire time, thinking about looking at a blade of grass, it's time for him to get up. And here we are in 51. And Whitman, standing in this field, shouts to the sky, listener up there, what have you to confide to me? He is asking specifically for some kind of response from somewhere. Someone to talk to him, someone to give him an answer. Now, the answer we will get later on in another short poem by the next phase of writers, by the realists who come really into power after the Civil War. And that's something we'll deal with later. Stephen Crane writes a short poem where a man said to the universe, "Sir, I exist." And the universe's response was, I feel no sense of obligation. Very short, but that encapsulates everything. And Whitman kind of has part of this transition in him. And 51 has the most beautiful phrase in all of it, something I've used repeatedly throughout the course of the year, something that we need to all take to heart. And it's, do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. How can you be so many different things each day? How can you say something today that you contradict tomorrow? And that's because you're never one person. You are everyone and everything that has come before you and will come after you. Because if we established earlier that in order for you to hear my voice, everything has to have been in a row, everything has to have happened in a specific order for you to get here now, you're setting the groundwork for what comes next. So if something is different tomorrow from what you believe today, that is because you are multiple people and you are all these different types of beings inside of you and around you and that you interact with. We've talked about this earlier too, where we wear masks depending on the situation that we're in. The kind of language that you use in the hallways with your friends or at the playground, at the skate park with your homies is totally different than the language that you use around your grandma at the Thanksgiving Day dinner table. It's not appropriate to be talking to grandma the same way you talk to your friends, and you're probably going to get made fun of if you talk to your friends the way you talk to your grandma. Everyone has expectations of who you are, because you're not any one person, in the same way that Whitman is not any one person. We are all different beings and different parts of one another. So what I think you are and what you think you are equally valid opinions. What you think I am, what I think I am, what my grandmother thinks I am, what my dog thinks I am, what the person that I passed at ShopRite thinks I am, all valid. How many people's lives have you walked through without making any impact on? How many people have walked through yours without making any impact on you? Whitman asks us to be mindful of how many different people we are. If everyone is the star of their own movie, how many extras are there that never get speaking roles? This is similar to another poem that Whitman's going to talk about, the one that's in Dead Poet Society. We're at the end. We're at 52. This is it. We're here. We did it. It took us, what are we at, like a half hour now? So if you're still watching this, thank you. Congratulations. You made it. You're now a Whitman scholar of your own, at least for this one poem. There's a lot more to read. This is just a part of Song of Myself. It's really not the whole thing at all. It's a lot of other really good ones. I gave you a couple of them, but you should really pick up a copy. It's like free online. You can use it all the time. Get the Dover Thrift Edition if you want. It's worth it. But verse 52, the last one. Whitman's up, and it's time for him to go. There's a lot that's going on in this poem. So let's just read the whole verse, and then we'll go back and break it down. The spotted hawk swoops by and accuses me. He complains of my gab and my loitering. I, too, am not a bit tamed. I, too, am untranslatable. I sound my barbaric yelp over the roofs of the world. The last scud of day holds back for me. It flings my likeness after the rest, and true as any on the shadowed wilds, it coaxes me to the vapor and the dusk. I depart as air. I shake my white locks at the runaway sun. I effuse my flesh in eddies and drift it in lacy jags. I bequeath myself to the dirt to grow from the grass I love. If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles. You will hardly know who I am or what I mean, but I shall be good health to you nevertheless, and filter and fiber your blood. Failing to fetch me, at first keep encouraged. Missing me one place, search another. I stop somewhere, waiting for you. And he's gone. So one of the things that we have to note about this is that Whitman is using a bunch of metaphor in this last stanza. So what time of day is it? It's late. The last scud of day holds back for me. Now, if you've been paying attention at all in lit class, you know that time of day, season, are all parallels for human existence, human life. So if we're now at the close of day, the last scud of it is holding back. So the sun is setting. It's just about over the horizon line. What's he paralleling here? His own death. He's saying, it's time for me to leave. I bequeath myself to the dirt to grow from the grass I love. That's a specific word that means to leave behind after you die. You bequeath your favorite pair of shoes to your cousin. You bequeath your giant stack of gold to your favorite nephew. Like, that's what that word means. So he's doing that on purpose. He's saying, not only am I giving up my spot in the grass for you to find on your own. But I'm also giving up myself to you. If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles is a pretty stark description of being dead. He's under the ground. He has now become grass in that great circle of life in which we are all connected. You know that part in The Lion King when Mufasa and Simba go for a walk, and Simba says, "Dad, what about the gazelle? Don't we eat the gazelle?" And Mufasa says, "Yes, we do, but when we die, our bodies become the grass, and the antelope eat the grass." That was antelope. And so we are all connected in that great circle of life. That's Walt Whitman. That's it. He stopped somewhere, waiting for you to find him, to join him. Because every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. And we're all connected. I don't know how I'm going to animate that, but it'd be really cool if I could put a circle in there. Well, that's Song of Myself in a nutshell in 30 minutes, but you should read the whole thing at some point. I remember one time I read the whole thing in a sitting, and I was going through a particularly rough time in college. It was rough, and I took this book, and I went out, and it was like fall, and I sat, this is a very nerdy English teacher thing to do, I sat under a tree by the lake, and I read it. And as I was reading it, this leaf fell down into my lap, and it's got this little hole in it that you can see through. Crazy. And I've had this for, I don't know, like 20 years, and it's been in here right on the title page of Leaves of Grass. Got it. Lots of other ones marked, and you should do it. I'm very jealous that you got to read it for the first time, because it was life-changing. This is a set of poems that made me want to do this. So I'm really glad that I got to share this with you. If you're still here, thanks for watching all the way through the video. Hopefully you go out and read a bit more Whitman. He is the man. And look at him. He's beautiful. Say bye. Bye. I love you guys. I almost forgot, there's this really awesome thing about Walt Whitman. He lived long enough that we had recording technology. So if you want to hear what Whitman sounds like, you can. I'll link it somewhere in here, maybe in the description, but it's exactly what you think he would sound like. He's like super old during it too, and the recording's hard to listen to, but it's him reading America, one of the other poems I think I gave you. All right? Have fun.